We'll move into the last session that we'll cover today, which is the types of procurement. We talked about a little bit about this going forward, but if we kind of look at it, there's two types of procurement. We talk about the public side, and we also talk about the private side. As we noticed that the vast majority of the market here in the US is really on the private side. So the major class 1, the class 2, and the class 3. And some of your questions that you had, Veronica and Guido, is that, how would an SME enter the US market? And it really depends on what the product or service is and where the customer base is. Are you selling to an OEM? Are you selling to an operator? Are you selling to a construction company that is installing the tracks or maintaining the tracks? Are you selling software? So it's really going to be dependent. And working with other European companies and Asian companies coming into the US, they always tend to start with trying to find a partner or someone that actually is based here in the US that understands the procurement process from a very specific point of view to that specific customer, and trying to do it from an SME that has never entered the US directly from Europe could be very confusing and also very frustrating. So we'll talk about the public procurement side, and then of course the private procurement side, which Shane has mentioned on this class 1 operators, some of those procurement steps and the gates they have to go through. So on the formal side of the public side, you basically have sealed bids, RFPs, and then of course for the smaller purchases and the micro purchases. And as you, very similar to other parts of the world, it really depends on what the project is, the value of that project, and who is the customer, and what are the regulations under that particular customer. So in a formal procurement method, typically it's for larger projects. So in this particular case, we're saying this is not necessarily a rule, because it is different between state and local laws and the individual agencies and individuals. So the city of New York might have a procurement process for the metro system in New York that is going to be different than what Amtrak is doing, or for the city of Miami through their light rail, or you even get to, let's say, the light rail system that's in a smaller city like Milwaukee, where they are the 20th largest city in the United States, but they do have a light rail system, but it's very short. It's only a few kilometers, and it's to move people within the central city. So if we look at the sealed bid side, typically very similar process where there's going to be a call for individual bids or or for proposals. And these are, you have the technical side, and then of course you have the commercial side of any particular bids. And typically these are for supplies, equipment, and maybe some of the smaller construction projects. So if you're qualified on the technical side, then you're open to provide a sealed bid. So for example, in my small community that I live in, almost every project that's over 100,000 US dollars will be under this sealed bid process. The vendors say that they're going to meet the specifications or the regulations, and then they provide their commercial bid. Larger projects, when you're looking at multi-year projects or multi-year services, or larger projects or railcar procurement, or establishing an entire communication or signal system, typically this is your request for proposal, and then of course you get multiple lines of competitive negotiations. Again, you meet the technical specifications or whatever the requirements are on the product side or the technical side. Can you meet the delivery dates? Can you meet all the technical specifications of that particular request RFP? Of course, once the technical part is fulfilled or you qualify, then of course you go move into the commercial ramifications of price, delivery, service, after service, warranty, and alike. And typically that becomes a very competitive negotiation. Again, I'm really talking at this particular stage of the public tenders here, not necessarily selling to the class ones, because there's going to be much more negotiation and flexibility in the private sector, whereas the public sector, especially if you're following some state rules or local rules or federal rules, there's going to be a number of rules that have to be met so that there appears to be a very fair process in the response to the RFPs and the competitive negotiations. The Buy America regulations, and I know this is usually a very, a lot of questions are on this, but we'll just talk about it at a very high level and not necessarily the individual level. Most of the Buy America regulations are any regulations that specify that a certain percentage of the product that is being supplied is sourced by US content, and not necessarily is it I would say the overriding factor is US content versus who's the seller. Although having an office in the United States definitely helps, but it's really rules based on the US content. And I will also mention that this Buy America is when the government is really funding it. So if it's the federal government, the national government that is funding the process, the project, even though it might be a local project, then typically these Buy American regulations are in force. So you might have a city metro system, let's say New York, that is trying to upgrade their subway system or their light rail system. They'll be looking for US federal money. Then typically you have these Buy American regulations. Similarly, that many states have their own Buy America regulations, and there might even be in-state regulations. So for example, there was a large project in the state of Wisconsin where the state government legislated that the after sales service of that rail system was based in Wisconsin. So this is in-state, by the state regulations, because the state money was being used. It had some federal money. Well, if you had a service and warranty service and after sale maintenance depot in Wisconsin, well, that's in the US. But because it was a state funded project as well as the national, they were looking for a state development. So a lot of the local suppliers, for example, development of some of the services, the maintenance, the hiring of employees and things of this nature was part of the tender, was that they hired Wisconsin people in that particular project. Again, kind of stress that these are government funded projects. Amtrak obviously is one of them, but as we have been talking about through the whole process here, the public market is much smaller than the private freight market across the entire US. Shane has talked about the Federal Railroad Administration rules, as well as the Federal Transit Administration rules. But again, we'll focus on, it's based on US content. Now, there are waivers that you can have exceptions to it. So if there is a product that is not available in the US, okay, that's not manufactured in the US, and you can provide documentation that says it's not available from any US supplier, that potentially could be waived, that requirement, and be supplied by a European company. The second waiver that's normally used is that if there is a product that is available in the US, but it's much more expensive, and usually there's a threshold, maybe that's 20% more expensive, 25% more expensive, 30% more expensive. If the product says, hey, the product or service is going to be much more expensive and much more economical to meet this government funded project by sourcing from a non-US company because of price and delivery and all the other commercial aspects. That also could be waived as well. So you're going to see these two types of waivers being met by foreign companies, especially against their US competitors. Let me stop here. Is there any questions at this point?
Yes, so thank you very much, because this is always a very tricky point. As you mentioned, usually it is addressed at a higher level, while when coming, I mean, to the specific case, one never knows, I mean, what can happen. So for instance, this is not a question, this is maybe just a consideration. So product not available in the USA. I mean, what in principle could not be available in the US? Okay, so this is the very first question. Then during our previous mission, in 2019 in the US, in the framework of another EU-funded project, yes, we were explained this is more about innovations. Okay, something that so far has not been developed. Okay, and this is something. But here the question could be, first, do you think that in case we are able to organize, meet the buyers, okay, meetings, could we ask, I mean, specific past cases, I mean, of products that they could not find in the US, just to have an idea of what we are talking about? This is one point. And the second is, I mean, at what step should a company ask for the waiver? I mean, is the waiver to be requested once the public procurement is open? But in such a case, we know that public procurements remain open and not that much, not that long. I mean, 30, 40 days. Okay, so in such a case, I mean, one maybe should be ready, or the waiver can be asked at any moment, and yes, just to have all the documents ready. But in such a case, the waiver can apply now, because now a product is not available in the US, and maybe after 6 months, yes, it is. After 12 months, yes, it is. So how long is the waiver valid?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Veronica. And like every other question, it depends. Or every other, but the products that we have seen, not necessarily in the rail industry, but government procurement, where the products are not available, I tend to be highly innovative. So for example, control systems that use integrated circuits, I see circuits that are not manufactured in the US. Software that has been developed that is advanced, that will substantially reduce the ongoing cost, and it's been done. I know there's a number of software companies that have tried to look at waivers where the software engineers were actually Indian or Ukrainian or something, or Russian or something like that. Well, this is pre-embargo, right? So, you know, if you kind of look at it, well, yeah, it's a US company, it's a US software, but if you really look at the content, it's a lot of foreign inputs to it. So it really depends. The waivers, I would also tell you that when you apply for a waiver, especially on these large procurements that have requests for proposals and negotiations, you will have other competitors that will challenge that waiver. Okay, and they're going to say, no, 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 no. Our product is U.S. made and it fits the technical specifications and alike, right? You're gonna when you go into these waivers, you're gonna actually, meet the competition. When are the waivers available? Typically, when you're submitting the proposal. That's where you start, because you're going to say, I'm a foreign company. I'm sourcing it from Europe. I'm manufacturing. I know that there are Buy American regulations that's in the RFP specifically. And this is my answer to the RFP. So we're going to be asking for waivers. Typically, there is a long process in documentation, and it depends on if it's, again, who is the buyer in this particular cases. And again, I'm just going to reiterate, on the private side, you don't have any of this. You might have some Buy America from a marketing standpoint, but as we can find, we can see that we have railroads that have Mexican tracks, Mexican content, Canadian buying into the United States. So if you're in North America, yeah, you're going to have this. Is that it?
Can I just ask a
Sure.
question on this, the same topic of waivers? Is waiver requested by the seller, the supplier,
yes,
the company participating, or the company or the buyer?
No, the buyer's not. The buyer is going to be a government, let's say a city, state, or Amtrak or something like that. They're never going to supply ask for a waiver. The waiver is going to be the supplier that's asking, yes, we meet the waiver exceptions under the Buy American regulations.
Okay, understood.
Now, one thing about a lot of these larger projects, especially for SMEs, is that you're looking for a partner in the U.S. And this is especially if you're just entering the U.S. If you're not fully knowledgeable and you have limited experience, you're looking for a partner. And whether that's a distributor, a dealer, or some type of OEM that's actually going to have this. If they're used to selling to major projects like this that are government funded, typically they will help you, guide you through this, because it's in their best interest also to win the project with your whatever the supply that is coming from the SME in Europe.
Thank you for emphasizing this, as because yes, be aware that in the meantime we have run an SME survey. We surveyed some 84 European SMEs that have interest in this. In public procurement, because as you mentioned, there are some that are selling directly to OEMs. And in such a case, what we asked is, public procurements, therefore launched by local, regional, national public authorities, public rail infrastructure managers, and public transport operators, or remove public, because of course the US is such a special case, but these are typically, according to European mindset, the key typical issuers of public procurement. And yes, and at the same time, so we have identified in any case the need, to pack them into consortia, okay, with both to be stronger from home, starting stronger from Europe, and on the other hand, it is very important, of course, to get connected with the local companies. And among the questions that we made, there was also what type of channel they are, sales channel they are currently using, and also attaching a different importance to using distributors, to using local agents, to using joint ventures, and also to understand how ready they already are in order to, to step up as quick as possible with the local companies. So how much they are already used to enter into this type of partnerships that are about business, are about the technicalities, and about also, as said, different business culture.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, as you know, Veronica, you know, these kind of what's the market entry strategy, what's your who's your partner, who's going to be part of the consortium, the size of the opportunity, all of this is, yeah, we do this on a regular basis for all our clients. Basic questions. You know, I always say that there's three questions when you're entering a market. One, is there a market for my product? If the answer is yes, the second question is how big is that market? And if the market is that big, let's say the US, then the question three is what's the business model and the business plan to maximize my effort? So putting that business, and then the fourth thing is who's going to execute. And at the very beginning, we talked about a little bit about our company, EM Wasik Associates. That's what we do, those four things, and then we actually execute. So we would be, more than interested in working with any SME that's looking at the United States to help them divide that strategy going forward.
That's fantastic, and I thank you in advance for that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. All right, on the SME side, these are SME public, and this is one question I believe, Veronica, you said. There are special rules for SMEs, and interesting, by the Small Business Administration of the U.S. Commerce Department, a SME is under 500 employees. That's, in many cases, that's a large organization. So we've seen organizations that are turnover of 300-400 million and that are still considered small, medium sized by the United States government. And again, classic, it really depends on what state and what's the federal procurement. Typically, there is a pre-registration that qualifies you as a SME under that particular procurement. And while it's relatively straightforward, and we talked about this by state of registering it, if you're a U.S. Organized corporation or enterprise, there are rules that are that are stricter for non-U.S. owned entities, but it is possible. So it's not impossible to make yourself available through some of these public procurements that allocate X amount of the funding to small and medium-sized enterprises, but they tend to be, there's a couple more qualifications that are necessary. Again, it really, when you start talking about the Buy America under government funded projects, it's about the content, not necessarily who owns who's the seller. Okay, so if you have a small office, just hypothetically, if you have an SME that's in Italy, has an office here, let's say in Illinois, in Chicago, they have two people, a administrative person and a business development person, but all the product is coming from Europe, that's not necessarily going to be qualified. But if you have maybe 12 people here, they do some advanced engineering, they're doing all the modifications, they're doing the technical work that makes it specific for that particular project. There might be after service depot here, spare parts, warehousing, light assembly, then that you're going to have a higher probability of qualifying under these procurements. Now, on the informal side, these are for smaller purchases. And again, depends on who your customer is and what agency, but typically it's anything under the 100,000. It's really to facilitate the purchase of goods and services that are smaller, that not necessarily go through the 100% competitive process, but it is for those smaller purchases just to facilitate the actual procurement. From a staffing labor standpoint, you can't have a competitive bid on every single procurement of every single item or service. So on the small, typically you're looking for 2 or 3 written quotations, very informal here, purchasing the goods, meeting some specifications, whatever that might be. It might be maintenance services, technical services, maintaining some of the equipment, something of this nature, get a couple competitive quotations, and then they'll pick one and sign a contract going forward. And of course, when it gets into really small things, let's say buying office, paper clips or pencils or even printers for your computer. These are micro purchases, and they're really based on a reasonable and a fair quotation. Again, some of the states and localities, they'll have a very low limit, like $1,000 or $600 or something like that. Otherwise, there's pre-approval process within the organization that is necessary. But again, these are for those small purchases that are taken on a regular basis. Again, when we, you're going to hear this from Jan, and you're going to hear this multiple times here. Here, our personal opinion is the best opportunities for European companies coming into the United States is going to be to the railroad, the private side of the business. We've talked about the 600 different rail operators, not to mention all the companies that support them with all the equipment, signaling, software, maintenance, and alike that actually supports that infrastructure as well. This is on the private side. Shane went over some of the procurement requirements for the Class 1. And again, this is a wide range of capital projects, equipment, rolling stock, tracks, signaling equipment, labor, maintenance, services, whatever those systems are, office, supply, software, and things of that nature. It's a real wide, whether it's a Class 1, Class 2, Class 3. Typically, the Class 1s, as Shane has mentioned, has supplier qualifications and applications that have to be done through. Most of them, there's not really a requirement that there's a U.S. office, but it's advantageous. And really, from a standpoint of servicing your customer, it's very difficult when you're 7 hours difference. And so, some of these large, if they expect a question, they're not going to wait till tomorrow to get the answer. So many of the best ways to set up an office here in the United States to actually hit that supplier qualifications, but more importantly, servicing that customer. And then you build the relationship with the procurement department manager, whatever that product category is. So all these organizations, they might have, especially the medium size and the Class 1, Class 2, and some of the larger, the holding companies, they're going to have procurement departments that specify that actually are divided by product category, whatever that product category is. One thing I will also mention is that the United States is such a large, and we mentioned this earlier, do not expect any of these operators to have a very vibrant import or international department, logistics department. Okay, the vast majority in the United States companies are not well educated and knowledgeable of international logistics. Okay, and then the smaller you get, the less that you're gonna understand. So if you're selling to one of these Class 3 railroads, do not expect them to know how to import the product. All right, this is where you're looking for a distributor, dealer to actually facilitate the importation and then the actual sale, which is a domestic sale. Obviously, the large Class 1s, they have their own procurement departments. They have a very active logistics. They might even have massive contracts with trucking companies and other logistics and ocean freight companies. But the smaller you get, do not expect them to be knowledgeable of how to import the product directly from Europe. The suppliers do have the portals. We talked about that earlier. I think, and some of them have the, we can look at some of the details there. Almost all the major suppliers, especially the large holding companies and the class 1, have supplier manuals that kind of help you understand what the qualifications are to become a registered and qualified accepted supplier. There will be compliance issues that they have. These compliant issues could be anywhere from product specifications to the terms to things of foreign, labor. As you know, here in the U.S., we're very cognizant of human rights and let's say low wage wages in other Asian countries and African countries. So there could be some compliance regulations, not necessarily applicable to Europeans, but these are the type of compliance things that might be in those supplier manuals. And then finally, everybody is going to have a contract of some sort. And again, most of the contracts are basically on the domestic side. And you're going to see tomorrow when we start talking about business formation and how to interact businesses, is that the United States norm for business practices is they like a written contract. And so all the terms and conditions of that sale, that procurement, the actual buying is written in that particular contract. So one thing that I've noticed by non-Americans is, why is it that, the US contractor always likes 20, 30-page written procurement contracts? We are just basically, we how do I say, secure ourselves through a legal written document. And of course, if there's a breach in that contract, then obviously there's a adjudicated a suit of some sort. But yes, that is a common complaint that I see from non-American companies, that we actually like contracts a lot. And you will, the larger organizations will have contract administrators. So their whole job is to administrate and negotiate and maintain the contracts, multi-year contracts, project contracts, even basic supply contracts.